brotherhood, multiplication, restoration. We are Sin Network. We're a family, planting churches together. Join us as we hear from leaders of this movement from across North America and discover what it really takes to plant churches everywhere for everyone. Daniel Yang.
Hey, Dhati.
The man, the myth, the legend, missiologist, church planner, all those things. Like what
more myth than legend.
Director of Sin Institute. So I mean, what do you go by these days? I know I call you Gandalf. You just kind of come in and go out, you bring wisdom, and then but you're my guy that I come to, for
That's
wisdom,
funny.
for knowledge.
It's funny that you think about me that way because I feel, for me, I think I was just like, man, I'm just so curious about things and curious to what God's doing, what He's up to. And so I don't ever think of myself as a knowledge, wisdom type person. I just think I get asked a lot of questions. So
yeah. I mean, have you always been curious?
I think so. Like if you look at my Enneagram type, all that stuff, like if you're an Enneagram cult follower or whatever, that's kind of my background. I was an engineer, and so just kind of for a long time, that was my first career. So that's just kind of the way I think. That's just kind of the way, I process things. So
okay. So as an engineer, how did you get into kind of the missiologist world?
Yeah, I was an engineer, 24, 25, struggled with my faith, and just started saying, God, are you real? And so that launched me on this trajectory of studying philosophy, theology. And then as I was going through that journey, realized that, these questions were forming inside of me because maybe God was using that to connect with those who, aren't believers. And so that kind of launched me in the journey of, well, what does it look like to reach people who were like me? And that eventually became church planting in North America. I thought we were going to be missionaries, my wife and I. We're thinking, well, God's probably given us this story. Maybe we're going to be missionaries somewhere abroad. And we start realizing that, the need here in North America is great. There's tons of people who either grew up in church and fell away from faith, people who never had, a faith background at all, and have these questions. And so we had such compassion for these people because of my own personal journey. And so we started just trying to reach people like us, and that launched us into a church planting journey, which brought us down to Dallas, and then to Toronto, and then to Chicago.
Yeah.
Yeah.
How was it? I mean, you're one of the few that have planted in North America, like when you're talking about, a big part of Canada.
Yeah, Toronto.
Dallas, Toronto,
Yep.
So what was there a very big difference between the two and just kind of how you engaged?
Yeah, in Dallas it was different. I wasn't planting, but I was leading young adults ministry, and then I was also a part of a church called Northwood Community Church, which is a church planting church, and so I was a part of the training processes there. In Canada, I did plant, and I parachuted in, and that was very different because Canada is not the United States. We just forget that, but
Right.
the very different context, they think differently. And so that was much more difficult because I had to really learn how to be a missionary in that environment because, it was basically things like, using the metric system versus, miles and pounds and stuff like that. To politically, different way to engage civically. They just have a different philosophy around politics, around morality, family. And so just learning those things, for me, it kind of activated the missionary side of me.
Yeah.
And then now we're in Chicago, even though, my primary role is to lead the Sin Institute. I've developed just a missional community around us and just learning what does that look like in Chicago back in, the 2020, North America, because when I left United States to Canada, that was back in 2011, 2012. It felt like a different America back then too.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
People always talk about global cities, and different things. Is Chicago closer to Toronto, or Chicago more like Dallas, or one of the in your estimation? What are those contexts more like?
Yeah, Chicago's unique because geographically and size-wise, it is closer to Toronto, and they're very similar in even just the way the city's set up. But because of the historic composition of Chicago, because of the Great Migration, I think that's the big difference maker about Chicago is the African American presence, which is actually dwindling in Chicago. African Americans are moving out. And so that makes it very unique. And so Chicago is a city that's declining. Toronto is on the upswing. So when I say it's declining, it's losing population, maybe not necessarily relational capital. or equity, but it's losing population. So there's some unique challenges in Chicago because of that.
Besides just always being cold, but they're cold.
And it's always cold, man.
In both places, like Toronto and in Chicago.
And if you're a White Sox fan, then you're miserable.
Yeah, that is so true. So you're in Chicago right now. You're leading
Sin Institute.
Right? How is that going?
Yeah.
How is it going? You've been going for a couple of years now.
Yep.
How has that been going? And are you meeting your intended purpose?
Yeah, I think we are. I mean, there's some things that we're tweaking because we're building as we're moving along. But I think some of the I'll give you three things that I think we're really excited about. Number one is we're starting to see that people are looking to not just the Sin Institute, but obviously Sin Network and NAM as an older sibling or an older brother or sister in the church planting world. There's a lot of respect. There's a lot of every time I'm with people and I'm sharing the knowledge that we have and convening people, and they know that we're connected to the North American Mission Board. They're just like, we're just so thankful for the kingdom resources that you're bringing to the other groups, different denominations. So that's been really neat to see how, in some ways, we get to extend the work of the North American Mission Board. Secondly is...
Which, by the way, I think is so critical.
Yeah.
Because as me not growing up in the church and even coming through kind of a DTS, Independent Bible, coming in, jumping full in with Southern Baptists, but wanting to make sure that, we at Sin Network, yes, we are explicitly Southern Baptists. We are not afraid of our tribe, but we intentionally want to be denominational.
Yeah.
So I think that's huge.
Yeah,
I'm glad
to bless other people. Yeah, absolutely.
So that's awesome.
And constantly we just get recognition. I mean, not like us get recognition, but there's recognition given to the board here. And then secondly is in the area of just building relationships with crucial organizations and partners. We have been working with some, with InterVarsity, with Crusade crew, and just thinking through what does it look like to partner, because they graduate 13,000 college students per year out of their program. These are missionally minded, young adults that are moving to the cities. They want to make a difference in their career. They want to make a difference in the church that they land in. And so we're saying, well, how do we help you make those connections to organizations like the North American Mission Board? And we did that this past year, and working, I think we're pioneering something in Boston with them. Yeah. And so developing those partnerships, because we think that's crucial to, passing the mission, the burden of church planting onto the next generation. And then thirdly is just in the way that we have been convening people. And so I wish that there is a body of knowledge that I feel like we're confidently just giving to groups and saying, this is how to plant churches towards the future. But the reality is that, we don't know what the future looks like. So we don't know what exactly are the best practices for the future. But when we convene people to have a conversation, it helps them to see, okay, this is where you're at. This is where we're at. Okay, we're facing struggles here. This is where we're doing well. And when you get 12 or 13 of those groups talking around those things, innovation, collaboration, it really brings up the energy level, and people go back to their strategies excited and more informed. And then they start making their own relational networks. So that's more exciting.
You talk about you've been convening for denominations, missiologists from different tribes coming together. Yeah. What are you guys seeing? What are you seeing around kind of the state of North America currently? I know you say you can't tell the future, but what are you seeing currently? Yeah.
Well, so in terms of the numbers of churches being planted, we're actually in the process of updating some of those numbers. The best numbers we have are from 2015 that say we plant about 4,000 churches a year, which is not terrible. It's a good number. And then on the flip side, though, we close about 3,700 churches a year. This is across denominations and then from the non-denoms and networks that we have numbers on. And so if you think about it, we net about 300 churches a year. This is across the board. So in some denominations, I would say, to be honest with you, some denominations, they net 0 or net 1 or 2 a year because of that. And so, and that's not a discouraging number in a sense, but it just shows you the urgency that we're in these days. And so, based on what we think, in order to keep up with population growth, we need to net, this is going to be a shocking number, but we need to net around 1,800 churches a year to keep up with population growth. That's keeping a ratio of one church to every 1,000 people in the United States. If we project that out to 2050, our population is going to be minimum 400 million. In order to keep up with that ratio, we need to net 1,800 churches a year. We currently net 300 churches a year. So, and that's a
We need to net, not plant. We need to net 1,800 churches.
Yeah, which means two things. And I think the strategy that we have at the North American Mission Board is a good one. We need to revitalize churches because that's kind of the back door, but we need to plant churches because that's kind of the front door.
And when you get these numbers, is that total churches? Like, how do you get like independent churches, non-denominational churches, network churches? Like, how do we kind of aggregate that information of some of these places that are more like underground or not necessarily?
It's harder to do, very independent non-denominational churches that are isolated. And so there are, Hartford Institute has a non-denominational research arm where they focus on calculating those things. Warren Bird recently did something similar, I think, around mega churches. So it's harder, but with denominational reporting, most of them, like we have at the Southern Baptists, they have statistical people that actually report these numbers. So it's a little bit easier with denominations. But by and large, because denominations, people are still affiliated with denominations, we still think that's the bulk of church planting.
Well, let's talk about it like that, because it seemed like there was a time where, people were planting more independent, more non-denominational, network-driven, kind of going away from denominations.
Yeah.
What have you seen in terms of the trends of planting with denominations or not planting with denominations?
Sure.
And what have you seen with that?
Well, one trend is this. The trend is less with the church planters. It's more with the denominations. I think a lot of denominations are starting to realize that their heyday was, maybe 30 years ago. There was a blip in the 90s where denominations thought they were bigger than what they were because of just different social things, social reasons. But the heyday of a lot of denominations were probably the 60s, 50s, 60s, and then 70s, almost across the board with the few exception of a few, denominations began experiencing a plateau. Mainline denominations, they basically fell off really fast. Evangelicals have stayed kind of consistent. So the trend is with denominations realizing that we can't be this vertical organization, When you stay vertical, you're stuck in time, And so so we're seeing denominations actually become more kingdom-minded. There is a denomination in Canada that actually, denominations in Canada are a little bit smaller than in the U.S., and they said, you know what, we're going to plant any kind of church. And so they took their resources and they started a different kind of network that plants, any kind of church. And so, that is a trend. I don't think every denomination is going to do that, and I don't think every denomination should do that. But I think denominations are realizing that if we just stay vertical about our brand, then it's going to affect the kingdom dynamic. The trend among church planters is, I think, probably in the 2000s, there was this kind of really gung-ho mentality. I'm going to go out there. I'm going to do it on my own. And you realize that there were just so many people who didn't make it, not because they weren't gifted or called, it's because they didn't have the support. And so I'm seeing guys that are gifted, talented, and they're saying, you know what, I want to do this with an organization. I want to do this with a denomination because I want to show my younger sisters and brothers that, there's something better when you do it with family. Yeah. And so it's kind of like the American family. You see a lot of people saying, I want to do this as a family.
Yeah. So, are you saying that now that there seems like to be more of a trend to kind of plant with some of the mainline denominations more than just independent? Is that what?
I think so. Well, I think what we're seeing is that the denominations have been able to respond to the what we saw in the 90s and 2000s, and saying, why are these people planting non-denom? Oh, it's because we weren't supporting them.
Yeah. Okay.
Oh, it's because we were too rigid. Right. Oh, it's because we wanted them to plant very denominational churches. Right. And so denominations have been able to respond to that. 20 years later, we're seeing people saying, now that they're more open, like we're excited to partner again.
Are you starting to see more people take on the language like network or network of networks, and and like, are you seeing more of that, less of that? Like it seems like micro networks. Verge. Yeah. Not the Verge. I'm sorry. Exponential, coming up, is about to do a whole thing on just kind of networks.
Right,
I
right.
mean,
Yeah.
how is that like playing out right now in our day?
Yeah. As a matter of fact, the list of different kinds of networks, we send us to, we help consult with them on that list. So I think the phenomena of networks will continue because we have networks within denominations.
Mm-hmm.
So even Send Network, that's a network within a denomination. Pillar Network, that's there's multiple of these things. Summit, right? And so that's a phenomenon that I think is important because what it does is it actually is showing that the ownership of church planting is not just the denominations; it's actually the local church. Because a lot of these networks are local church driven.
Yeah.
And so I think that's a good thing. So if you have if you have churches that are planting enough churches where they feel like they need to create a family of a church, a network, then that's a good thing. I think, what we need to be careful of is if you just create a network so that you can, have a homogenous, group of churches that are insular, then I think that may be a little bit more we should be cautious about. But I'm really encouraged by some of the churches that are developing networks because they're planting churches and they, in a sense, have son and daughter churches that they want to parent towards the future. And that's a good thing.
Yeah. I mean, do you have any stats on just kind of the idea of success rate, whether you plant larger, smaller, big, is there anything that kind of speaks to, as a planter, if I'm thinking about being a part of a network, being a part of the Send Network, for instance, or starting my own network, like, are there any stats as a church planter? Is it better to do it on your own or is it better to be a part?
Yeah. Oh, there's no question. I mean, I don't have a straight stat for you, but there's no question that the church planters that have additional support outside of their local church resources do better long term. And I think a part of that is pretty clear. When you have not just financial resources, but when you have coaching and training, and then you have a sense of affinity, and affinity is huge, then you have more confidence to move forward. It doesn't mean that the person who's out there doing it solo isn't going to do well, but I think what we're seeing is that because there's a general resistance to evangelistic church planting, more so today than we've seen 30 years ago. 30 years ago, you could still do launch large because you're able to attract the nuns and duns of the time. The nuns and duns aren't as interested in coming to worship services anymore. And so, and because of that, churches are launching smaller, which is okay. They're launching smaller, and so the additional support allows them to go longer, even though they have less resources in the local community.
Are you seeing leaders, are you seeing leaders forming these networks more geographically or affinity? You mentioned that, or is it a both and, or like, what are you seeing that trend going?
It's both and. It's both and I like that. I love that. I think affinity, like for instance, Drew Hun, who is a friend of ours, he started a network called New City Network, and its focus is to develop leaders that typically come from marginalized communities and to plant churches that are typically reaching urban areas. And so that's affinity based. So they're going to, they're predominantly based out of New York City, but their network is spread across North America. And you have regional networks, like you mentioned earlier, Tampa Underground, and they're very focused on Tampa, Southern Florida.
No, and that's honestly the reason why I love leading this network, to put a shameless plug for us, for the Send Network, because, on one end, like we talk about planting churches everywhere for everyone, and the ability to be to have both affinity based, larger, smaller, being able to have those things within our network just really gives the ability for us to, tackle this. And this, the fact is that we are not doing this alone. No planter plants alone. And that's what really was the reason why Blueprint Church, we planted Southern Baptist. This is why we planted the Send Network, because of the fact that we believe that we can do better together than apart. And I really think that that's exciting.
Absolutely.
So
I mean, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, the Send Network has a very unique dynamic in that it's a national, approach to church planting. but because you have city focuses and you have, every regional focus is large enough to be its own kind of like church planting entity. And there's a lot of strategy there that we're learning that can be shared across the board with other organizations. And I think that as we build the strength of our cities, which I think the city strategy is crucial, as we build the strength of the city strategies, I think the overall national strategy will become stronger.
Yeah. Man, I really appreciate it. Thanks for sharing. This is why I call you Gandalf.
Thanks for having me, man.
This is like a living almanac.
Right.
Appreciate you.
Thanks.
You have been listening to We Are Sin Network, a resource of the North American Mission Board. For more information about today's podcast and other relevant resources, visit sendnetwork.com.